Thank you, Milad. We'll now begin.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today for this panel and to have the opportunity to share some of my thoughts from my research as a postgraduate student, but also my involvement in extra university knowledge spaces, in particular with La Revue Assiégée. I joined 2 years ago as editor-in-chief, and which is a French language journal produced by women, trans and queer people of color who develop critical analysis of racist, capitalist and colonialist structures from minority perspectives. This panel invites us to reflect on the question of internalization of power, nationalist logics, and sexual exceptionalism by queers, including queer people of color. This is a question that seems essential to me because it is only by considering the conditions of the participation in the construction of the common sense, according to which Muslims and the inhabitants of migrant suburbs in France, French banlieue, are more homophobic than the others. It is only by identifying these conditions that we can develop counter strategies and reformulate the questions we are called upon to answer. Today, I will focus on the participation of racialized homosexuals in the construction of a homophobic problem in the French banlieue. We may wonder whether in some debates this participation has not been overestimated, whereas in the field of non-white queer political struggles, anti-racist collectives proliferate and tend rather to recall their inseparability with their communities, thereby relating them to larger questions concerning ostracized migrant families. In 2015, the March for Dignity and Against Racism was the subject of a smear campaign based in particular on a call to boycott due to the presence of homophobic figures. Racialized queer and trans people then launched an appeal to recall the inseparability of their struggle with that of their communities. This tendency to assess the legitimacy of anti-racist struggles based on their opinions on gender and sexuality issues is quite common. And it limits the scope of possibilities available to queer people of color whose voices are vulnerable to co-optation or attempts to neutralize criticism of racism. In addition, a reductive reading of intersectionality possibly led to an understanding of queer people of color as doubly oppressed, renewing their status of exception, which is, for instance, particularly striking in the speeches on LGBT asylum seekers. So sociological studies highlight, as Salima Ammari does in her pioneering study of migrant lesbians, and Anwar Ougeram with regard to queer Muslims, that there is an active desire not to dissociate oneself from their communities, to protect themselves economically and socially, but also to protect themselves from racism. The activist João Gabriel has pointed to the risk of focusing our critique of sexual nationalism and homonationalism on formal and discursive aspects, while disregarding the material conditions of our existence. He warns that we, and I quote him, that we cannot succumb to homonationalism and its founding lie, which is our sexual minorities are free and you are oppressed, while claiming to fight them. We can indeed wonder about the ways of forms of resistance to homonationalism within queer people of color collectives, but also in monofocal forms of anti-racism, which focus exclusively on race, especially because in Republican universalism, the latter struggles to impose itself on the political agenda. One can wonder if the modalities of these resistances do not reproduce an imaginary geography according to which some are already liberated and the others not yet liberated. The reign of anecdotal and testimony in debates on these issues, and this is also a self-critique, only allows us to measure our own ignorance. We must locate the speeches of the banlieue homo, which breaks the silence on the so-called out-of-bounds area of the Republic within the framework of a form of French sexual exceptionalism based on what Nasser Aghenif calls virtuous racism. This virtuous racism has a positive side, the affirmation of a French exception in terms of arrangements between men and women, and a negative side, the need to bar those who threaten it, for example, Arab and Black boys from the suburbs. Do queer people of color voices necessarily legitimize virtuous racism, a logic that legitimizes the remoteness of Arab bodies, veilers, and rapists who purportedly threaten French sexual harmony? At the time when she was writing, Ghenif identified several positive figures of Arab otherness, and through these multiple figures, we can gauge a form of fragmentation of the class of immigrant families by putting them in competition with each other, specifically in their ability to assimilate into prevalent sexual norms, which turns into an ideal of citizenship. The economic and social conditions of families resulting from post-colonial immigration are found masked by a set of discourses that hold them responsible for their own social misery and focus exclusively on the allegedly deviant sexual arrangements of these groups. Homosexual figures are not considered in the ideal types of especially racialized homosexual figures are not considered in the ideal types of Nasser Aghenif when she wrote her article. First, because there was the authentication of a sexist problem in the suburbs, which was played out by the media coverage of collectives such as Ni Pute Ni Soumise. The collecting of testimonies from young suburban girls who were victims of sexism by journalists played an authenticating role, according to Marion Dalibert. We can already note that it is in the interaction with media and political actors that this problem arises. We cannot oppose a voluntarist and decontextualized discourse on resistance to sexual norms, a discourse that constitutes resistance to imperialism or racism as a voluntarist and decontextualized horizon. However, it is sometimes in the form of accusatory and individualizing policies that the media appearances of gay men from the banlieue have been criticized. The accumulation of testimonies coming from those gay men living in the banlieue now authenticates a homophobic problem that is said to be endemic in migrant suburbs. Brahim Naidbalk wrote an autobiographical book to document the conditions of homo in the banlieue. He was encouraged by Franck Chaumont, which was former communications director of the organization Ni Pute Ni Soumise. Chaumont had gathered the testimonies of gays and lesbians who live in the banlieue in his book Homo Ghetto. We also find the documentary film Banlieue Gay, which includes several points of view: a gay man living in the banlieue, a lesbian who has left it and goes through various detours to avoid lesbophobic violence when she visits it. More recently, Lies Alouane was the subject of significant media coverage when he denounced the daily homophobic violence in his banlieue in Gennevilliers. He then joined SOS Homophobia, which is an organization heavily involved in producing statistics on homophobia in the suburbs. Without going into the details of this case, we can note that the inhabitants of the area have argued that it is a manipulative attempt, which is more of provocation. The intrusive nature of journalistic investigations into homophobia can only straighten and materialize this culturalist discourse on the specificity of Muslim homophobia. What I would like to offer today is a line of thought that removes itself from kind of a polarization of debates, which coerces us into always answering the question, are the descendants of the colonized homophobic? I believe it would be beneficial to rephrase the question rather than always provide a response, because there are only two options. Like some would say that homophobia is not specific, and the other options is homophobia constitutes a form of resistance to the imposition of sexual norms, or a form of reaction to imposed competitions among migrants. I think it would be fruitful to think from and with the perspective of the homo in the banlieue, which breaks the silence on the homophobia of the so-called out of bounds areas, the lost districts of the Republic. That is to say, areas with a high immigrant and proletarian presence. When Salima Amari works to highlight the conditions of lesbian migrants as working class and migrant, she makes a valid statement in my view. I think that we can usefully locate this discourse of culturalizing and specializing homophobia in the spatial logics of segregation. In other words, given the experience of second and third generation migrants living in these spaces where immigration is distributed along lines sometimes nationalized and ethnicized, and whose employment prospects are limited, it is not surprising that homophobia appears specific to these spaces, especially since it does not come in its most sophisticated forms. That is to say, one of the conditions of possibility for the activation of these culturalist discourses is the class and racial experience of homosexuals in the banlieue, who, like others, grew up in socially relegated spaces. The weakening of class consciousness is probably reified by the idea that sexuality constitutes the subject's proof, its authenticity. The constant confrontation of homosexuality with Islam in European public debates leads to making homosexuality, according to Dodink, a racial category which refers to whiteness. This is only possible because homosexuality has historically referred to racialized populations, including in France. These discourses help to reinforce the idea that all queers are white and all people of color heterosexual. Two critical axes are open to us, and I think they are perspectives that we are trying to bring to light in the journal Assiégé, as also in other queer people of color autonomous spaces. First, we are working to situate our conditions in conjunction with those of our communities. And I think we could go so far as to signal the forms of participation in nationalism in the continuity of our inclusion in segregated, ostracized spaces. When queer, lesbian, and trans people of color are the subject of such racist policies, benevolence towards them appears to be a form of cruelty. The contrast between the benevolent and empathetic discourse on LGBT asylum seekers or homosexuals in the banlieue and their real material conditions of existence points to the inherent contradiction. We need to expose these contradictions of heterosexual public culture, because it is precisely in spaces where heterosexuality does not need to be expressed in order to be presupposed everywhere that its symbolic inclusion tries to be realized. The best contemporary example is Asylum. Second, our stories are made of mistransmissions from our communities. Therefore, we must work to render these absences visible. These transmissions, these stories, namely resistance to racism and imperialism among racialized queer and trans people of color, but also to a form of imposition of Western sexual epistemology among all descendants of colonized people, have been actively silenced. We cannot build a political project on absences, specifically those absences that have been naturalized. I believe it is time to rethink our views and face the uncertainty that lies ahead, and to also think of other modes of address rather than the reaction to current events, which forces us to respond to a certain framework. I believe that it is in these directions that a number of queer and trans people of color initiatives have been thinking in France. They have been producing an anti-imperialist, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist archive. The Queer et Trans Révolutionnaire Collective, QTR, works to think about the materiality of the conditions of trans folk, in particular through their overrepresentation in non-standard economy, thereby starting discussions on specific forms of racism that target people of color. The recent publication of the book Afro-Trans, edited by Case Rebelle, the Case Rebelle Collective, also responds to this need of centering these voices, analyzes thoughts and creations. With La Revue Assiégée, we sometimes try to disorientate the problems, decenter the way questions are being posed by taking an interest in what, for example, radical Moroccan feminists have to say on how homonationalism works and on the articulation with sexual struggles in Morocco and their interaction with anti-racist speeches in France. We try to create the conditions so that our points of view converge whenever the debates tend to turn into one-sided for communication. I would like to close this brief presentation by saying quite simply that it is difficult to ruminate on an archive which is in the process of unfolding and in the process of being made at the same time, to borrow from Jasbir Puar and her work, Tourist Assemblages. I believe that the general question that these debates have raised is the question of the subject of anti-racist struggles and whether queers and trans people of color can be considered those subjects. I believe that I would like to keep this question open while arguing that there are critical possibilities in thinking from these positions, including pushing the issue of racism center stage onto the political agenda in France. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Milad, for your discussion, and thank you for spontaneously agreeing to read the English translation. We're very grateful, and